Welcome to another episode of the Share Your Story series. This is a podcast experience where we get to explore humanity one heart at a time. I'm your host, Jenny Dilts, and I'm the founder of Grieving Coach. My website is grievingcoach.com. This episode, I have my guest, Robert Pardi, with me. Thank you, Robert, for joining us.
Hey, Jenny, thank you. And I have to say, for everyone that's listening, if you just see Jenny's enthusiasm, that's what makes it so great to be on this. She and I connected a while back, and I'm just thrilled that I was invited. It's so great to talk to you again. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
It is going to be a lot of fun. Every connection, every conversation just gives me so much energy. I wanted to share a little bit about Robert. He was born in New York City, and he's one of those rare individuals who embraces change and lives what he calls possibility in action, taking his desire for transformation and putting it into action daily. He received his MBA from Columbia University and was quickly recruited by the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, one of the largest sovereign wealth funds. Shortly after, his wife Desiree was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. Unfortunately, she passed 11 years later. After throwing caution to the wind, Robert left from his comfort zone. He changed careers and moved to the same Italian village his great-grandfather immigrated from over 100 years ago. He is now a certified life coach, adjunct professor, international guest speaker, and author of Chasing Life, the remarkable true story of love, joy, and achievement against all odds. Yay!
No, that's who I am. And I'm glad to say that I'm also a friend of yours. So that's great. So, but no, thank you for that. And before we just start, so the whole idea of possibility in action, right? You were just talking about, the nuggets you've gained and the experiences and all those things. And part of my whole philosophy is just like yours, right? We live all these amazing things, and if we don't share them, there's really no value. It's just like we put them on, like, I always think of my grandmother's curio cabinet, and she would put a little figurine inside and it just gets dusty, right?
Mhm.
I don't want my experiences to get dusty. I want to share them because that's really the gold we all have in our lives. So I'm so glad.
This is going to be a fun conversation. First of all, where can people find you?
Oh, sure. If they want to find me, they could just go to my website, which is robertpardi, PARDI.com. I tend to be on LinkedIn more than any other social media, but I also am on Facebook and Instagram. And then if they want to learn a little bit more about the personal story we're going to talk about in a way, they could go to chasinglifethebook.com.
Awesome. And I'll have those in the show notes as well.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about the context that the book was written from.
Sure. Well, the context is pretty big, right? Because I met this amazing woman when I was really young. She was 17, I was 19. And we were one of those icky, gooey couples that, were always together, holding hands. We always had to be touching each other. And we really grew up together. She was really dynamic. She was a really ambitious, determined woman. And she decided to pursue an MD, PhD. I was pursuing finance, more out of a desire to escape a situation I grew up in as a child. So money to me was going to be the saving grace, let's say. And unfortunately, in the middle of basically everything happening for us, everything great, she was doing her MD, PhD, she was excelling. I was excelling in my career and was recruited by the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And the context of the book really is more about what an amazing life we actually lived. The fact that we learned regardless of adversity, there is always joy, and that you can't chase joy. You can't seize it. You actually have to lean into it because it's always there. And that just means being open to it. So that's the context of the book. And we had to learn in a way which is really very relevant to what you do, is to understand losses and to understand the process of dealing with that.
Mm-hmm.
And after she passed away as well, having to look at all of that in my life. And here I was an investment banker. I was the finance guy, right? I grew up in the age of Gord Gecko and Greed Good and Wall Street and everything else. And my experience completely changed my perspective, and to not be afraid to let go of that the old perspective, to in a way lose that,
Mm-hmm.
and then move forward with something new. So it was very dynamic. It sounds weird for a lot of people when I talk about these things. His wife was diagnosed with breast cancer and she passed away, and yet he's talking about joy and moving forward, not moving on, never moving on, because a loss will be a thread in the fabric of your life, and depending on how big that loss is, the bigger that thread. I talk all the time, I'm beautifully scarred for having loved and cared for my wife. But it's a scar. Of course, it's a scar.
Yeah.
So the context really is, there are two sides, right? And what's talked about a lot in terms of a disease journey and a loss journey is the pain, which of course was there. But there is another side of that, and that's what the book is about, and what chasing life means. I could describe that going forward, but I'll turn it back to you to ask me another question so I don't hog the stage, let's say.
I think it's a amazing point. I love the idea of beautifully scarred, because as much grief as there is, there's also gratitude. Grief can give us the opportunity to create our lives in a way that we want to. And I'm not trying to minimize the pain at all. I'm not trying to say it doesn't hurt, move on, move past it, it goes away. No, none of that. Because like a scar or like an amputated limb, it's not coming back. But you can learn to do amazing things with it.
I so love that. And I'm going to be perfectly honest that the beautifully scarred thing, in a way, I did steal from Harry Potter. So if anyone's a Harry Potter fan, they know what I'm talking about. But Harry's scar was because of the love his mother had for him that protected him from, Voldemort and that whole thing. So that's what I think about, right? Is that scar is because of love. That scar is because of a beautiful thing. Yes, it hurt. No, of course it hurt, but I have it, and it's such a big scar because there was so much love. And so that's, very well that loss, or the depth of loss, is based on the value we gave what we lost, right? The loss is in a way a measurement of how much value we gave to something. Maybe you lose, we just talked about this, everybody, before we started the show, that I remember Jenny talking, I believe, about a keychain, right? You lose a keychain, okay, it's not that big a loss. You lose a keychain your grandmother gave you as an heirloom, that's a much bigger loss, because there's more value to that. And part of, for me as well, you were talking about an amputated limb or something like that. So much that's involved in loss is the loss of the expectations of how our lives should have been. Right. And to me, when I started looking at the journey I needed to go through, And I'm a big acronym person. So I came up with the acronym for grief. And I realized that for me, it was understanding guilt, rumination, impermanence, expectations, and managing fear. Because the only way to move forward is to overcome the fear of future losses and being hurt again. There's so much involved in that because we don't realize how resilient we are when we suffer a loss, because we're involved in that emotional aspect of it.
Mhm.
But we're still standing.
Yeah.
And I'm a spiritual person. I was brought up a Roman Catholic, but I'm really not a practicing Roman Catholic. But the Psalm, as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the key word is to walk through. I joke all the time. We're not meant to pitch a tent, start a fire, and roast marshmallows in the valley of the shadow of death. No,
Yeah.
we are meant to walk through. And whatever this is, when you start to need that self-awareness of what you need to walk through, but that's not where you should be living, right? That's not where life actually takes place.
Mhm.
So I love that you brought up the idea of so many different losses. My wife, you know, she, when she was first diagnosed, they only removed, because back then, it was much different. It was 1997. She just turned 31. She had found the lump a year earlier. She didn't have a family history of breast cancer. She was extremely healthy. They weren't going to send a woman at 29, 30 years old for a mammogram. She had a history of cystic breasts. So when she had the radical mastectomy, it was only on one breast. So she had a remaining breast.
Mhm.
The loss she encountered of her femininity was enormous.
Mhm.
So there are so many different things, right? Because so much, here's another acronym for me: loss is the lack of self and security. We lose part of our identity. It has a dramatic impact on identity. And just think about her breast. It had a dramatic impact on her identity as a woman. And she was, I mean, to me, she was gorgeous, but everyone did say she was a very beautiful woman. And here, all of a sudden, this happened. And having to try to find something to balance herself so she looked okay in clothes.
Mhm.
And how does a woman like that feel comfortable with her husband, and us having to deal with intimacy issues in that.
Yeah.
So loss is so much more than just the passing away of someone.
Yeah. And when I work with people, that's one of the first things that we do is we name the losses. It's the loss of the person, the loss of the thing, the loss of expectations, loss of relationships, loss of roles, loss of ideals, loss of future. There's so many ways that one loss can impact our whole, like our whole life and environment and community.
Right. And all those things you just mentioned, right? They are all based on expectations. My wife and I was supposed to be, the investment banker. She was supposed to be the successful doctor. We were going to live in a loft apartment at some point in time in New York City and have an amazing view and all of these things. And then all of a sudden, there is a big, in Italian, basically they say bastone tra le rote. I'm not saying it exactly correctly because my pronunciation since I've been in the United States has just diminished entirely, but it's putting a stick between the spoke of a wheel, right?
Oh, yeah.
Um, and so all of a sudden, everything is jammed. The direction you thought you could go in, you might not be able to go into. Um, just my wife, she loved the beach, and wow, it's very hard for a woman to go on the beach with one breast. What type of bathing suit are you going to find? And then we found ways around that. We found bathing suits that you could put a prosthesis in and all kinds of things, but
Mhm.
there is all of that, that all of a sudden you have to look at those expectations. Are they valid anymore? Do they define you? That's why, the conversations we've had in the past as well, we're so aligned with this idea, like you said, you have to name the loss and you have to understand the impact on that.
Mhm.
And also loss is, because again, it's based on value, right? So it's different for people and it's unique. There is no right way to go through a loss. It is a unique process. And um, we've become a society in a way that doesn't know what to say in those situations. And so we tend to tell people, don't worry, you'll get over it, or, just move on, and it's done out of good intention for sure. Because we don't have that vocabulary anymore to talk about those things. I grew up, and I'll talk on the death side of it. I grew up where I lived in an Italian American family where when somebody passed away, they wore a black band on their arm, the men,
Mhm.
and the women wore black, and it was discussed. Uh, and it was discussed more openly, not just about remembering that person, but about sitting there and seeing someone uncomfortable, watching your grandmother cry hysterically and knowing it was okay for that to happen, and that I was there only to witness it because
Yeah.
she needed not to feel alone. Because even the journey of cancer, I say this all the time, I was next to my wife I was not leaving her side. I didn't leave her side at the funeral. I actually insisted that I be the one to put the coffin in the furnace. I was not going to leave my wife,
Mhm.
but it was her own journey as well. Like, she was alone a lot with her own thoughts.
Mhm.
And part of my role in that was to give her the space to let me know those thoughts and not make her feel uncomfortable, or that she was wrong. She wanted to scream. And if she wanted to scream at me, um, it was better to have that happen than not give her space to actually go through what she was going through, because then she was going to be alone while she was with me.
Mhm.
And boy, you know, if people read the book, it is a love story, right? So it sounds very nice, but boy, do we have fights, and her saying, I don't want to be married to a parent, and you have no idea what it feels like to be the one that has to contemplate death. Which was funny because the way we managed it, she actually didn't know the progression of her disease. She never wanted to know, and she asked me to manage that. And so I was actually living the disease for her,
Uh-huh.
understanding when the doctor would say, well, now it's in her, lower spine. Okay, well, we'll just keep telling her it's in her liver and we'll just go along this path, right? Um, but it wasn't for me to say back to her, well, no, actually, I do know, because all she wanted to know was she could be a human, right?
Mhm.
And the whole thing, and this is a topic more of caregiving than grief, but the other thing that I realized is my role wasn't to fix, because then that would have made her an object.
Yeah.
My role was, again, the witnessing, the support, so she could be a person. Couples have fights all the time, crazy fights. But then all of a sudden, when there's a disease in the middle, everyone thinks they should walk on eggshells. But you're two people trying to live together,
Mhm.
regardless. And the disease shouldn't, at least we decided it shouldn't be the focal point. But I've deviated a little bit. But the idea of loss and grief in and of itself it's very unique.
Absolutely.
Nobody can tell you the right way to do it.
Because there isn't a right way. Grief is so individual. Even with the same loss, everyone has a different relationship with that person or thing or place or circumstance that is lost.
Yeah.
And I think what you talked about how society doesn't like to talk about grief and loss. And I think one thing that contributes to that is that we don't like to, like, we like to have standard things. You do this, you do this, you do this. I can control it, I can predict it, I know what's going on. Grief is not like that.
But even life is not like that, right? We want what you just said about we can predict, and we believe we can, but we truly can't predict with such great accuracy as we've created ourselves to believe.
Hmm.
And so that whole idea of needing something standard, it makes everyone much more comfortable, because when we're in that unknown, when we can't predict the outcome, it's really uncomfortable, right? We feel almost impotent in a way to what's happening around us because it's unknown. And so we back away. It's not to say that, you know, the don't worry, you'll get over it and everything else is wrong. It's just there's such a completely different vocabulary that the people that are grieving need to hear.
Yeah.
And you learn that as you're going through it as well. From the very beginning, when she was diagnosed, our vocabulary changed. What we needed from people was different than what we needed in the past. And, you know, we didn't want that sort of head bob, is everything okay? You know, that sort of look on the face of pity. And again, that was done out of really good intention.
Hmm.
So I love that there's more conversation about all these topics, especially coming through the pandemic. You and I just both talked about this earlier. You know, there was an amazing article in the New York Times that mentioned we're going to enter a pandemic of grief because there were so many losses, and not just of people, of, like you said, roles, responsibilities. My role changed as my wife got progressively more ill,
Hmm.
to more of a parent.
Yeah.
And because regardless of if we didn't want it, someone had to clean up her throw up, or, you know, help her to the bathroom, or that role changes. And there was the loss of the role of us being a vibrant couple, and that couldn't have been ignored at
Hmm.
all.
Yeah.
So it was and continues to be a very interesting journey, to tell you the truth.
And that's the thing with grief. It's not static. The journey changes depending on our experiences, our growth or lack of it. Um, our life, you can't stop time. Like, you can't say, all right, my person just died. This thing just is no longer. I've just experienced this major loss. I want to stop the world. Many
Oh,
people want that, but it's not possible.
I can't tell you how many times I actually said that. I'm like, can we just take a pause for 5 seconds? Like, please, you know, let me catch my breath.
Hmm.
And that is, it's such an overwhelming feeling, when that happens, right? And that's just overwhelm in general. How many times do people feel like they have to catch their breath when not even talking about grief and loss, right?
Hmm.
Just in general. And I love what you said at the beginning of people, you know, that this is sort of something that they can do on their own, you know, go inside, self-awareness type thing. What I realized is the need to catch my breath was based on almost me not wanting to recognize some things. Like I was saying to the universe, let me catch my breath before I have to deal with that.
Mhm.
But it was actually the dealing with it that created healing. The avoidance of it made it bigger and made it heavier. And that's the hardest thing I think to actually do, is to put your toe on that water, right? You don't want to
Yeah.
put your toe in that water. It's sitting there. You know you have to deal with it, but you don't want to deal with it. And it could be, in the case of a loss of a person, maybe dealing with clothes or something. My wife and I love her deeply to this day, and we were very funny with each other. But um, after when she passed away at the hospital, um, I whispered in her ear, and I said, "Okay, baby, you know who I am. So yes, I'm going to go back to the apartment, and I'm packing up all your clothes, and I'm going to give them to Dress for Success, because you know me, this stuff has to be packed up." Now that was my way of doing things, and I'm also someone that tries as best as I can to add humor into things. I think that
Mhm.
comes from my childhood. And so humor for me has always been a coping mechanism. And so that was like, telling her that, and so forth. And I did. I packed up her clothes, and I gave everything to Dresses for Success right away, because I'm somebody that rips off the Band-Aid.
Mhm.
And this is where I think a lot of people, when they are confronted with loss, maybe there's a lack of self-awareness of how they deal with things, that they don't know what the strategy is. But when you're more self-aware of who you are, and this becomes a life skill, right? I
Mhm.
just recently talked about how, for me, caregiving is probably the most extreme boot camp of life. And it requires you to actually learn who you are. And in
Mhm.
that, you learn your life skills. I also grew up with an alcoholic dad, so that taught me a lot of things where I did learn. I'm somebody that rips off the Band-Aid, right? So that gave me the ability to maybe deal with grief a little more um, constructively or proactively.
Mhm.
But the journey with Desiree as well, we both learned how to live life very consciously.
Yeah.
And so that was another skill I brought in. Okay, here's this grief. I know who I am. I know what my skills are, let's say, of how to deal with this constructively. I had to be conscious in making decisions, and I learned that as well. So there are so many complexities as to why, outside of just the emotional aspect of the loss itself, that, in my opinion, make loss so hard and make grief so big.
Mhm.
Um, but the more you know about yourself, or how you define yourself, like that hashtag possibility in action, it's the action part. I'm not someone that can sit still. If I'm in the valley of the shadow of death, I'm running through. I'm not going to walk.
Yeah.
I'll change the psalm. Okay, so that will be in my version of the scriptures going forward. But
Uh-huh.
um, we're but again, that's me. That doesn't make it the right way.
Right. And it's not for everybody. Some people, like my kids, hate Band-Aids. Even if they're hurt, they will not use Band-Aids because they hate ripping off that Band-Aid. And they like the alcohol method of soaking it in alcohol, rubbing alcohol first so that it comes off easily
Okay.
or more gently. Um, and it's so important to know your style,
Yes.
because when grief comes, when we experience grief, not only are we dealing with all of the complexities of grief and loss, but many times we have to figure out who we are again.
Yeah, so true. So true. Because we are different. That's the funny thing, and it's somewhat based on those that expectations. But you know, here I'm a life coach now. I was an investment banker. The whole journey, my perspective shifted so dramatically because a loss creates a shift in perspective. Regardless, it does almost create this shift of awareness where you have to say, okay, so now what's next?
Hmm.
But you can't know what's next if you don't know who you are, right? Because you have to craft that's what's next. You have to be constructive. The
Yeah.
funny the Band-Aid thing, you know, they're children, so they couldn't understand or understand this or think this way. But I think part of what happened for me as well is, and you talked about before, stories and relationships, and we have relationships with our stories as well, which is extremely important to understand why we have certain stories or why we hold on to certain stories, which of course is a little different than what we're talking about. But for me, I wanted to be the type of person that would rip the Band-Aid off. I want to be the type of person that will just walk into an ice cold shower and say, this is, okay, there's no hot water today. It's okay. Instead of like, um, but that comes from how we define ourselves. And loss and grief are moments of self-definition, because
Absolutely.
you have to ask yourself, how am I going to show up here? Because we don't want to, but we have to. And it's not just talking about the loss of a person, like we've been saying, but we will all be confronted with loss and grief.
Hmm.
We can't avoid it. It's part of the journey we've signed up for in this life. I mean, at
Yes.
the end, our train also reaches the final destination. We don't know when the stop is, right? But that requires us to understand, well, how am I going to show up in this life? People, when after my wife passed away and I said, okay, I'm moving out of the country, I'm going to go back to Dubai. I was in significant debt, so I had to actually stay in finance for a while and pay everything off. And then I followed my dream to live in Italy. And, yes, I was an investment banker, but I was teaching English for $8 an hour in Italy because I needed the money. I needed the $8 an hour. I spent it all taking care of Des.
Mhm.
Um, and I had people look at me as if I was wrong, or maybe that I didn't love my wife. They're like, how can you do that? And I'm like, because the definition of who I am is to do that. That doesn't mean I don't have pain. I have pain to this day. I'm in New York City, which I haven't been in a while, and walking by Rockefeller Center and seeing the Christmas tree being put up. We would go every year when they first brought the tree into the city, and it was just and I was, yeah, it tugged at my heart. It
Mhm.
really did. But the definition, the philosophy with which I want to live my life, I looked at it after she passed away, in the grieving process, and asked myself, okay, does this definition still hold valid? And if it does, what do I need to do to live that definition? That has nothing to do with me not being in pain, or that the loss wasn't significant for me. But it's that idea of, it is this beautiful scar, and it is for me to carry that scar forward, if that's the definition of who I am.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's sort of what led me to live in Italy and recreate my life and have new experiences.
So much amazing stuff. For people who are struggling to find their definition of who they are and what they want to create in their lives going forward, what what tips or suggestion would you
Well,
give to them?
great question, because these what's so amazing about these types of conversations we have that tend to talk about, loss, grief, even the journey towards end of life. It's all about life skills more than anything else. I mean, this life is for us to live. We are not to be used by life. We should be using life. So, if someone is trying to figure that out for themselves, first of all, there's something we used to do. And when I say we used to do, I sound like, I'm a 150-year-old man. But I'm thinking more what I saw from maybe my grandparents, because I was very close with my grandparents. And I actually knew my great grandfather that came from the town I'm living in now. They admired people. Today, we tend to compare ourselves, which is really corrosive.
Mhm.
But a way to understand who you are, or the potential, let's say, because we're so full of potential, we're so full of possibility, is if there's things you admire in people, it's because you're gravitating towards that. And that's already an indication of who you are. If you really admire someone that gives back to, they I don't know, they volunteer or something like that, there's something in you about wanting to be a person that's giving. If you are someone that admires someone that is amputated and runs a marathon, and that true admiration, that spirit just fills you, well, you know what, you are someone that wants to overcome adversity. That's part of it. There are lots of tools. There's values clarification and understanding what your true values are. But it just, more than anything else, it requires you to ask questions. A lot of times we don't, part of the grieving process, and I think part of even the caregiving process, is you're already suffering losses. And if you start to ask questions about who you are or what you really want, you might wind up losing the people around you as well,
Mhm.
because they know you a certain way.
Yeah.
Desiree and I, we lost family members. Oh, and I lost a lot of people in my life actually moving to Italy and doing all these different things, because they needed me to be a certain way in their life. And
Mhm.
so my changing then could alienate them. So a lot of times we don't ask ourselves questions because we're afraid of losing what we already have. But it really does come down to, you know, what is the story I want to live? Like, what do I want my life to represent? Um, what character am I playing in my life? Am I playing the main character, or am I playing a secondary character to others' expectations? And these are difficult questions. People, again, that whole idea of me moving to Italy, a lot of, and I'm not saying that everyone picks up and moves to a different country, but it's a mindset. It has nothing to do with the amount of money or not. I could have stayed in Dubai and I'd be pretty well off right now,
Mhm.
but no, I moved to Italy and was teaching English for $8 an hour, because for me, I wanted to be the person to, and I'm using this word very consciously here, to attempt. That's what I want my life to represent. And I say attempt because the more I've contemplated it, and this is so not part of a grief conversation, but the more I realized it, the word try, when we say try, we've already accepted all the reasons we can fail. There's a but that's buried in try. Yeah, I'm going to try. In our head, we're like, but this could happen, that could happen, and we'll be okay because I'm trying. So I've learned to tell myself I'm going to attempt, because it doesn't have the same trigger. Attempt for me is, yeah, I'm going to go out on the field. Like Brene Brown, she talks about a quote from President Roosevelt. It's the man in the arena speech, and it's about stepping into the arena. And yeah, attempt for me is stepping into the arena. These are all questions that really, or answers that come from questions that we ask ourselves. Who do I want to be in my life? How do I want to live? What do I want to represent?
Yeah.
We put lots of barriers on that because of the constructs around us. Grief, as you said very earlier, and I think that was key, is that grief breaks everything apart. It removes the unnecessary. Loss removes the unnecessary. When we realize how much unnecessary we've been carrying, it's shocking. And when we start to let that go, there's a lot more space. Everyone knows the term minimalism. What I think grief and loss have the potential to show us is living an essential life, or essentialism. What is essential to me?
Yeah.
And that sounds very selfish. A lot of people hear that and they think that we're putting ourselves at the center, and it's selfish. Living who we are, being unique, because we are, what a blessing that is, right? We're not all the same. There's nothing selfish in that at all, because then you're reflecting your uniqueness.
Yeah.
You're coloring the world with your own color. And so, because I use color because I love a kaleidoscope. That's my thing. I carry a kaleidoscope with me all the time. And we create a kaleidoscope out of our lives. Loss are those little fragments of glass as well. Grief are those fragments. Happiness, joy, all the things, all of that is in there, right? You can't have a half a kaleidoscope,
Right.
Or you can't have a kaleidoscope that's all one color. It's not going to be the same. So to get back to your question, I think what is so extremely important is, how do I want to show up in my life? What do I represent? And and this is the hard part, right? Being okay what the ripple effect of that will be. And I have a great friend, she talks about being a lighthouse all the time, and she and I talk about light. And I joke, we all have a light. And if somebody needs to wear sunglasses around us, well, then they're the wrong person. And that's natural selection. So maybe, you know what, if you really step into who you want to be, and it's loss and grief that opens your eyes, then, and people fade away, they weren't the right people for you. As hard as that sounds. So then does loss and grief become a catalyst for growth and change? And that's an amazing, because it sounds so wrong, right? Because we think that when we lose something and we grieve something, we're supposed to sit there and be crushed. Nobody said that has to be the case. We can be crushed and we can grow at the same time.
Yes.
And there is the power in all of this. And that's the same as the book with Desiree, and the life that we live together is this idea of adversity, pain, struggle does not have to be the definition of how you live. It doesn't have to be the focal point or the center.
Mm-hmm.
Tony Robbins is who Tony Robbins is. He talks about that Thanksgiving story and the turkey, and because he rose above that and said, that's not going to define me. That's a very conscious choice.
Yeah.
And so if we have a societal norm of, grief is supposed to be heavy, and it is. I'm not saying it isn't. Oh my God, it is. It hurts. It
Mm-hmm.
certainly hurts.
Yeah. Yeah.
But does it have to impede us, stop us, crush us, weigh us down? It doesn't have to at all.
Yeah.
It's part of a journey, and it's a point of reflection. When Desiree was diagnosed, which is the first of the losses you go through in a disease, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a grieving process the whole way.
Absolutely.
Grief is just not at the end, but you're grieving the whole way through. And then there's anticipatory grief, because you're when is the last day going to happen?
Right.
And that's what I mean about, in that acronym I gave, impermanence. When you realize that we're not meant to keep, nothing is permanent.
Mm-hmm.
There's not one thing that, plastic maybe, unfortunately, seems to be permanent in the ocean, but,
Yeah.
everything changes. I say on many podcasts, the ancient Japanese used a calendar of 72 seasons
Nice.
to actually represent change. We're just not as aware of change. And then we're trying to, we're very youth focused. So, we try to make sure that our face is very young looking all the time. we can hide the evidence of change, but inside we know everything is changing, right?
Yeah.
But if we have to give up everything on our deathbed. So everything is impermanent, regardless. And when you get to that point of understanding it, that anticipatory grief, I was able to let go of, because it's not about that last moment. It's about the day she and I were living.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's where life was taking place.
Yeah.
And so grief, anticipatory grief, opened that up for me. Because I was thinking, why am I living and feeling and worrying about her dying when she's right in front of me?
Mm-hmm.
She's living right now. We're living right now. We have the opportunity to laugh, cry, fight with each other, whatever the case is, but we have the opportunity to live at this moment. And so that's where I started gaining this concept of, wow, grief just opened a door for me to understand something and
Mm-hmm.
liberate me from some of that unnecessary, some of that worry.
Right.
And that's not to say we shouldn't plan and do all the things to try to avoid, let's say, the end result. But it was more the fact, wow, maybe grief is a tool that I could use to
Yes.
grow, to learn. So
Absolutely. And the cool thing about grief is that it's available to every single one of us. It's a tool that we are given as human beings. We all are born, and we all will face grief and loss
and
throughout our lives.
anyone listening is like, did she just say grief is cool?
I did notice that, and I'm like, yes, grief is cool.
Grief is cool. That's going to be a T-shirt. But that idea of it's a tool. What if we looked at our lives as we're here to learn who we are,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then that makes everything a tool, or we can utilize things and, let's say, reframe them as a tool. Somebody early on, my wife and I had this was one of the amazing things I think about Desiree. Regardless of what was happening, were able to have amazing conversations, like deep philosophical conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about anger around her diagnosis. And I grew up in an abusive relationship with an alcoholic dad, and anger around that. And we both realized that if we were happy with who we were, so again, understanding ourselves, self-awareness,
Mm-hmm.
if we could stand there and say, I'm happy who I am, then we had to thank every single thing that happened in our lives, even that
Absolutely.
loss and even that grief, because it made us who we were. And that was when, after Desiree passed away, I wanted to understand, yeah, I am happy with who I am. I want to look with curiosity and enthusiasm with who I can become. And I want to be happy with that. So who is that person? And that's where a lot of admiration came in. And I defined that avatar of who I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it was even walking further away from fear. Like I said, I could have been comfortable in Dubai. I had a great business partner. I had a nice life. And I said, you know what? No, I'm actually the type of person that, likes change. And that's who I want to be. I want to be a change master.
Mm-hmm.
And so, hey, yeah, I'm going to put everything in 2 suitcases and show up in Italy and not speak the language and not have a job and not know anyone and not have a place to live, and say, what's next? Would I have become that person if I didn't go through loss and grief? No.
Yeah.
And again, this is, we're having a conversation of coming through the other side. And like I said, I saw the New York City Christmas tree, and my stomach just went into a knot, because God, I miss my wife every single moment of every single day, and the pain is always there and the hurt is always there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's much more acute, of course, when the events, the loss happens, and not just somebody passing away, but any of those, you lose a job that defines you, right? Think about how many people lost their job during the pandemic, companies that went bankrupt.
Yeah.
That was what you were going to be, who you were going. Now, here's the rub, right? Were you going to be the successful entrepreneur, or was the definition just being the entrepreneur and taking that chance? And so the loss doesn't change the fact that you're somebody that took the risk. So now, how do you manage the fear to maintain that part of yourself?
I absolutely love that. The loss doesn't change the fact that you are the person that took the risk.
Right. And so the weight that you put on the loss, again, that idea that we talked about of loss is a measurement of how much you cared about or how valuable that thing was, just shows how much or how all in you were to a certain thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you had that big painful loss. That means that was so valuable to you.
Yeah.
And that's part of your definition. What I realized after Des passed away, I felt like I should have a relationship after she passed away. I was like, my God, life seems so empty, because how can I go on vacation alone? Or, I was 19, she was 17. I mean, it's not like I had great opportunities to date. High school doesn't count. It's just it's way too easy. Your lockers are right next to each other, and the next thing you know, your boyfriend and girlfriend. But and so I started looking at all those things and thinking I really should be in a relationship, and I don't want to be. And I realized really what it was all about was connection. It wasn't about the relationship, right? So that again, a lot of that came from understanding where my values lied.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, what I lost with Desiree, of course, I lost love and everything else, but it was that great connection.
Yeah.
So if you're that entrepreneur that lost a business, and forget the financial aspect, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this word, it sucks. It sucks if you lose a lot of money.
Yeah.
It really does. If you remove that aside for a second, and the loss is about, well, God, I really wanted to do that, and that was going to be my thing. That means, hey, that's what's important.
Mm-hmm.
That's what, don't give that up. That's still inside you. And so all of that I felt for Des, and I still feel for Des, it was all based on connection, and it was based on what I actually gave her or did for her. That's what led me to life coaching.
Yeah.
That, because I realized, wow, you know what? I miss helping her. And I'm not talking about in the negative way of, she was needing me, and so that gave me value, but it was actually seeing someone rise and watching them achieve their dreams. And that said to me, wait a minute, that's what I feel. That's one of those things that I feel like I really, really lost, which meant I gave it a lot of value. So what is that? Well, that's definitely not finance. And so that's how the evolution happened, because I wanted to look at grief. I didn't want to ignore it because it was painful.
Yeah.
And that comes from, my definition of, all right, it's painful, bring it on. Let's see what it's going to bring out. But that was growing up with my dad as well. So,
Yeah.
you hit me, I fall down. Okay, I'm going to get back up. Hit me twice. Look, I'm going to be able to take it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, so a long conversation here of self-awareness is key. And loss is an indicator of things that were important to you. Grief is an indicator of things that were important to you.
Yeah. I recently had a conversation with my husband about the griefs that he's experienced in his life. And what I realized was I have been saying that grief is the result, the natural reaction of loss or change. Now, my definition of grief is morphed into the loss or absence of connection of something that's valuable to you. And it doesn't have to be valuable in a positive way. It can be valuable in a negative way as well.
Wow, that's so great. That's at the very beginning, you said something about stories, but we have relationships to stories. And so, like you said, it might not be positive. The whole Stockholm syndrome, people suffer loss because they're not with their captors anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole big dynamic in that. So that's what's so interesting about the feeling of grief, because it's telling you something.
Yeah.
I love, the idea of just our bodies, or there's whispers in our mind and so forth. And grief is one of those that is trying to tell us something.
Mm-hmm.
And Oprah Winfrey says all the time, life will whisper to you, and if you don't listen, it's gonna poke you or whatever. But at the end, she says, and if you don't listen, it's gonna hit you upside with a brick, against your head or something like that. And it just makes me laugh, because that's what grief does if you don't engage with it,
Yeah.
it gets bigger and heavier, and it's going to keep pushing. And the thing is, like you said, it's all kinds of grief. It's not just losing a person that you love, but if you don't address it, because it's that big, ugly, hairy thing in the room that, yeah, that's just going to get bigger and bigger, and it's going to take up the oxygen. It's going to take up the space.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I found more than anything else is the moments that I allowed grief in.
Yeah.
And I can talk about this, with my childhood, but many different things. The moments I allowed grief in, I then became in control of the situation. The moments that I was pushing it away, it had all the power. And so, does that help people necessarily deal with grief? I hope so. There's a lot involved in that we couldn't talk about.
Yeah.
Does it take away the pain? Again, the pain is natural.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the thing is, are you walking through, or are you sitting there roasting marshmallows in that valley?
Yeah.
So I think all of this, and I hope the people listening are realizing that grief is a natural aspect of our lives, because loss is a natural aspect of our life.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't walk around with the Pollyanna rose glasses and believing that, Instagram is a real life, and comparing ourselves to that. When we're suffering, I found it very useful to look at those people that I admired that suffered or had resilience.
Yeah.
Because that's what I wanted to be in the situation.
And I think we're going to end on that note.
Sure.
Just if I can sum up our conversation, it would be, look to who you admire in your grief. Allow that grief to come in and teach you the lessons that I like to think of grief as a person. Allow grief to teach you the lessons that she has to teach you. And pick up those tools that she gives you and go to work and do something with them. Create your own life. Create the life that you want to live going forward.
I love that. That's the whole conscious thing. What I'd love to do is, because I know we got to go, but I'd like to say just there's a quote that I swear defined my wife's life, and it's by Richard Bach. I believe it comes from his book One, and it says, "We are all born with a block of marble and the tools to craft it into a sculpture. We can leave it untouched. That's inaction. We can pound it into gravel. That would be anger. Or we can shape it into glory. If we open our eyes and ears and hearts to all the things that are happening around us that we can learn from, we'll have the tools to shape it into glory."
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, what a great conversation.
Thank you, Rob, for being with us. And so many nuggets and insights, and not only for our listeners, but also for me in my own life.
Wonderful.
So yes,
I always
thank you
learn
so
from
much.
you. I always learn from you as well. So, grief is a teacher. I love that. Let her in for sure. So thank you.
Awesome. So definitely check out Rob's book, Chasing Life. Reach out to him at robertpardi.com.
Yep.
And chasinglifethebook.com. And he's also on Instagram, and more so on LinkedIn.
Yes.
Robert Pardi, and Instagram. Cool.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Rob, again.
Sure.
And thank you, listeners.
Take care, everybody.